In 24 years of my career as an educator, I've had the honor and privilege and opportunity to accompany students on service immersion trips. For any of you who have done such a thing before, you know the power of those experiences. I have accompanied students to the U.S.-Mexico border at 3 different crossings. I have taken a group of students up to the Red Lake Reservation and to the Blackfeet Reservation to study Native American issues. In cities across the country, I have spent time with students as they have explored the different issues of housing and economy and education and looked at solutions that might better serve that community. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about one of those trips. In December of 2000, I had the opportunity to lead a group of students on a civil rights trip. We went down and started in Atlanta, and then went to Selma, and then went to Birmingham. And we visited churches, we visited parks, we visited bridges, we visited homes that all of you probably would know about because they're very vital to the civil rights movement. One of those special moments for me was when we were in Atlanta and we got to visit the boyhood home of Martin Luther King. And then we went down the street to the Ebenezer Baptist Church where Martin Luther King was baptized, where he crafted his preaching style, and where he was co-pastor with his father. Across the street from the church is a museum on the civil rights and on Martin Luther King. And in the museum, they looped different speeches that Martin Luther King gave. And I was mesmerized and watched over and over again the video that he gave on the night before he was assassinated, April 3rd, 1968. He was in Memphis in support of the sanitation workers. I'm going to share with you some of the words from his conclusion of that speech because it's very powerful and it's very haunting. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. And I don't mind, I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. A couple of years later, I was in Memphis and had the opportunity to go to the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis. And the museum is designed so that you finish your time at the museum, the tour of all the exhibits, by coming into the hotel room in which Martin Luther King spent the night before he died. And then it brings you out onto the balcony in which he was shot. And I was on that balcony and was reminded of his words, I've been to the mountain and I've seen the promised land. Now from that mountaintop, Martin Luther King could see his vision of a just and free society. From that mountaintop, he was able to inspire and lead others on that journey to that promised land. We all know the dedication that he had to that journey. It was unwavering in so many ways against so many obstacles. His message continues to resonate with me almost 17 years later of watching that video. And certainly the image of heading up to the mountaintop and seeing the promised land has driven me in the work that I do, very purposefully looking at how do we build an educational system that is more equitable for all. The promised land and the mountaintop image also has meaning for me because I'm an avid hiker. There is nothing better than a day where I can reach the summit of a mountain and gaze out over the land see the peaks and the valleys from a very different perspective that's impossible from the road. When I'm sitting on that mountaintop, it is as though my own personal map opens up just as the geographical map does. From the mountaintop, for me, that promise means that there is an endless possibility, and I am in great peace in those moments. The Nativity School of Worcester is a member of the NativityMiguel Coalition. We're 47 schools across the country that have decided that we are stronger together, learning from one another, addressing our challenges together than we are as a single school. All of our schools have an extended day and extended year program, which means that in the summertime, students are together, they're learning, and they're sharing in community. Part of that experience for many of our schools is an outdoor experience that usually includes a hike that gets students to the top of some sort of summit. Now, we're not trying to create expert hikers here. The purpose of these hikes is to have students think of themselves in a different way, to build courage so that they can begin the climb. For many of them, it's the first time that they may be doing such a thing. And so taking that first step can be very courageous. It's about persevering on the journey. And it's about appreciating the destination once you get to the top of that mountain. So what does that journey look like? It's very different than perhaps other groups that might hike to the mountain. In some cases, with some groups, there's a group that sprints to the top, and they're up there and they're sitting there for a long time, and then there's a group that falls off the back, wondering if they're ever going to make it to the top. Our dynamic is very different as a group when we're making this hike. The most important rule is that everyone's voice is heard, and that may mean something different than you typically hear. What that means is that when the person that's in the lead says 1, the next person says 2, and they count down the line. And then it comes all the way back until it gets back to number 1. If there is a breakdown at all from 1 to the end, then the group stops. So that means that at any time, a message can be communicated up or down the line. Secondly, at all intersections, the group stops. Because it is known that when you're hiking with a group, that it's at those intersections where typically disaster can strike. One group will go this way and one group will go that way. Being able to communicate and hear up and down the line means that there is time to rest when people need it, and there is time for food and for water to be nourished on the journey. And this is about every student getting to the top at basically the same time. What I always love about these hikes is that the students that are more capable in the hiking, perhaps more physically fit, are so encouraging and motivating to the kids that are struggling. They'll come back and say, "You got this. Come on, you got this. We're almost there. Take one step. If you just take one step, you're that much closer to the top." It's a beautiful moment for anyone that works with kids to see that type of dynamic. And then when we get to the top, there is this overwhelming silence. Yes, kids are exhausted, they're tired, they're catching their breath, but they're also taking in the view. They're looking out and they're seeing with their own eyes from a very different perspective than when they're in their schools or in their cities or in their neighborhoods. For perhaps a few moments, these students are looking out and the possibility of that promised land is opening up before their very eyes. These are lessons that stay with the kids long after they've come back down and they're returned to their communities and to their schools. The lessons of reaching the mountaintop together means that when they're thinking about high school or they're thinking about college or family or career, that they are applying the same lessons. Take one step in front of the other and you're that much closer. Work together to get to your destination. But the beauty of the Mountaintop experience is much more than even individual success. What does it mean to nurture students? It means that we're providing an environment for them that reassures them that the promised land is real. That there is a place and there is a time that justice and love and freedom is the order of things. And more importantly, for these students, they belong and they have value in this land. That the promise is theirs as much as it is anybody else's. What does it mean to nurture students these days? It means that we challenge them to think that the responsibility of getting to this promised land is as much their responsibility as anyone else's, regardless of the obstacles that may be in their way. It means that the issues and differences that people may have is actually what brings us together, not divides us, so that when we are looking at a way of moving forward toward this promised land, that we do so in an acceptable way. Just like getting to the summit, this promised land is not about if you sprint to the top, you make it, and you leave others behind. What does it mean to nurture students? It means that we're offering them a world in which that promised land is accessible for all. And that if they are working, if they're playing, if they're in prayer together, if they're sharing in community, then it is going to mean that they are that much closer to that promised land. That has worth on the journey. I started my career teaching in Baltimore. And we all know that a few years ago, you may have seen on CNN watching the riots happen in Baltimore. Very similar riots happening a very short time before that in Ferguson. And we recall that it is 25 years ago that the LA riots occurred. And I was watching the National Geographic Society channel look at those riots, and they started by saying that the Watts riots happened 27 years before that. As a teacher in Baltimore nearly 20 years ago, the students that I was teaching at that time are now in their 20s and 30s. And so when all of that started to happen and ignite in Baltimore, I certainly was thinking about those young boys that I was teaching and what they might be deciding now as young men. And through the power of Facebook, it was real time that I'd see pictures that would come up and that I would see their response in the conversations that they were in. One of those photos of one of the young men that I worked with really made me very emotional. And I'm going to read to you what he had in his comment there. He was standing on one of the corners in Baltimore, and this is what he typed. "We are out here protecting corners and informing the young people. People may disagree, but we understand. We are here to say we love them, and we want justice for Freddie Gray." Any of you who are in education know how wonderful it is to see your students mature and grow up. And even more so, it's wonderful to see when they are out there doing work and witnessing in such a way that it is creating a more free, a more just, and more loving society, whether it be through medicine, or through law, or through media, or through education. When I read this comment that he was making on what was a very frightening, unpredictable night in Baltimore, it only reinforced for me how important it is that our students have those mountaintop experiences in which they're able to gaze out and get a glimpse of the promised land. And as teachers, as schools, as anyone working with youth, as parents, we need to make sure that we are educating, informing, and nurturing in such a way that we're providing young people with a voice, with skills, and with the leadership so that they may, like MLK, stand confidently in front of a group of people or a single person and say, well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop and I don't mind. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain and I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. Thank you.